the mantra, I would say, for everybody who's involved with horse sports, and you learn this one way or another, is never to give up. And if you're discouraged, don't dwell on it, but move on. I think of the setbacks that so many people had and the pressure that they were under. I mean, Laura Graves, let's use her as an example. I mean, she broke her back in a fall from this horse that was really sort of uncontrollable. Diddy, became such a legend and such a fabulous horse, but she did not have an easy time, and she finally put him up for sale, but nobody bought him. And that also, there's so much karma in these things, and fate plays a role. And if somebody had bought Diddy, well, maybe they would have gone to the Olympics, or maybe he would have been retired early because they couldn't ride him. But the fact that things worked out the way they did made it possible for her to make a name for herself and a name for him, and to serve the U.S. cause so well.
Welcome to the Practical Horseman podcast, featuring conversations with respected riders, industry leaders, and horse care experts. The show is co-hosted by Practical Horseman editors, and our goal is to inform, educate, and inspire. I'm Sandra Olenek, and this week's episode is with award-winning photojournalist Nancy Jaffer, who edited the U.S. Equestrian Team Foundation's book, Riding for the Team, Inspirational Stories of the USA's medal-winning equestrians and their horses. Riding for the Team chronicles the lives of those who dreamed about competing for their country and made it, sharing inspirational stories from the 8 equestrian disciplines of show jumping, dressage, eventing, driving, vaulting, reining, endurance, and paradressage. Readers are immersed in the personal histories of the medal-winning riders, drivers, and vaulters who have dominated American equestrian sport over the past 28 years. The book gives readers a behind-the-scenes look at the world of top-level equestrian sport. Athletes tell their stories and those of their horses during the years they honed their talent and dedicated their lives to representing their country in the Olympics, World Equestrian Games, World Championships, and Pan American Games. You can purchase the book at www.usct.org/Riding for the Team book sale. The book's editor, Nancy Jaffer, has covered 9 Olympic Games, and her articles have appeared regularly online and in the pages of Practical Horseman and Dressage Today magazines. She's a contributor to Horse and Hound magazine, Horse International, and In Stride, and she writes the Due South column on the Horse Sport website. She has her own website, www.nancyjaffer.com, and she wrote a weekly newspaper column on equestrian sports that appeared in the Star Ledger of New Jersey from 1972 until 2015. In our conversation, Nancy recounts anecdotes from the lives of many Olympians, including show jumpers Kent Farrington, McLean Ward, Laura Kraut, Rich Fellers, and Lucy Davis, dressage riders Laura Graves, Stefan Peters, Gunter Seidel, and Debbie McDonald, and eventers Boyd Martin, Karen O'Connor, and Amy Tryon. They're a treasure trove of great stories. Before getting into our conversation, I want to thank the sponsor of this week's podcast, Perfect Products. Don't waste your money on joint supplements that may or may not be working. Joint Impact, from the makers of Perfect Prep, starts working fast to make your horse more comfortable and improve joint health and mobility. By stacking proven joint support ingredients with soft tissue soothers and a nutraceutical show-safe pain blocker, Joint Impact quickly produces results you can see. Visit www.perfectproductseq.com or call 877-324-8002 to learn more. Available online and at retailers nationwide. Now, let's jump right into the conversation with Nancy, where she shares a little more about what the book is about and the inspiration for it.
It's about the backgrounds and great moments of some of our most distinguished riders in the U.S. and drivers. It talks about their background to a great extent so people can understand how they got to where they wound up, but it also gives thoughts about their sport, their horses, and their lives as equestrians.
And what was the inspiration behind the book, or how did the idea for it come about?
Bill Steinkraus was captain of the U.S. equestrian team and an Olympic gold medalist. had written a book after the USET had been in existence for 25 years called the USET Book of Riding. The USET was formed after the Army discontinued the cavalry teams, obviously, and the Army became mechanized, and it had no longer an interest in supporting teams for equestrian sport. So the USET was formed, and Bill commemorated it by talking to people who had been founders, people who had made a great mark in international sport, and also some of the people who perhaps their names were not so familiar, but they could offer tips on things in terms of riding and training horses and the sport itself. So in 1990, they thought, well, let's do another book. We need to do an update. And Bill started it. And then he came to me. I think he was very busy at that time. And of course, he'd been retired as captain of the team since 1972. And he handed it over to me. And we were doing a different format then, where we found a format very similar to the current book, where we found we selected people who had made a mark for the team in the various disciplines. At that time, the U.S. equestrian team only supported show jumping, dressage, and eventing, which are the Olympic disciplines, and driving, because Finn Casperson, the chairman at that time, was very interested in driving. And then for the next edition, which took 28 years to get going, I thought it was time, and I went to Bonnie Jenkins, the executive director of the U.S. Equestrian Team Foundation, and said, we should catch up with this, because there's a lot of people who've done great things since the last book came out, and I think people would like to know about it. And so we broadened it then, because the team is now involved also with vaulting and para-dressage and reining and endurance. So it's it's a broader spectrum of athletes and their sports.
And did the riders themselves write their pieces? How did you collect all of these wonderful stories?
I interviewed them, and I knew most of the riders, and I knew their stories, but I wanted to get a little bit deeper into it than I would have for a story in Practical Horseman or some other publication. Only two riders wrote, well, actually, Kerry Milliken, who was the individual bronze medalist in 1996 for eventing, wrote her story. She gave it to me as a draft, and we worked on it together, and we sent it back and forth. And then Kareth Lemon, who was a vaulter, did a little bit in terms of writing it, but we worked together on it. So basically, it was a real, it was really just an interview format in general, and we talked about what the topics should be. And sometimes the topics were really obvious. For Graves, everybody wants to know how she got Ferdates to be what he was when her mother had just only bought him off of a video when he was a weanling. So, how did he become an Olympic medal horse? So that one was easy, and we called that The Making of Diddy. It's amazing that in a lot of ways the titles suggested themselves. After I did the stories, the titles just sort of popped out at me or popped into my head. And then, of course, the writers had a chance to review the chapters after they were finished, and in general, they didn't add anything. They might have said, oh, I forgot to mention so-and-so who was my trainer, or I forgot to mention this horse that made a difference in my life. But basically, it was just a very cooperative, collegial process and a lot of fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun. Are there any general insights that readers can take away from the book that you found as you were compiling it?
Yeah, I think the mantra, I would say, for everybody who's involved with horse sports, and you learn this one way or another, is never to give up. And if you're discouraged, don't dwell on it, but move on. I think of the setbacks that so many people had and the pressure that they were under. I mean, Laura Graves, let's use her as an example. I mean, she broke her back in a fall from this horse that was really sort of uncontrollable. Diddy, became such a legend and such a fabulous horse, but she did not have an easy time, and she finally put him up for sale, but nobody bought him. And that also, there's so much karma in these things, and fate plays a role. And if somebody had bought Diddy, well, maybe they would have gone to the Olympics, or maybe he would have been retired early because they couldn't ride him. But the fact that things worked out the way they did made it possible for her to make a name for herself and a name for him, and to serve the U.S. cause so well.
Right. I thought was interesting about her story too was that he, in addition to her injuring herself, I guess he once dislocated or he broke his jaw, if I'm remembering that correctly. And that's
right. Yes, he broke it. He was sort of a mischievous horse. Was always into everything, and they had those iron bars on one of his stalls, and he somehow got his jaw caught and then broke it. And again, Laura just stood by him. Some people might say, that's it for him. He's never going to be able to. How would he keep his mouth closed? If his jaw was crooked, and how would he be able to actually be on the bit? And she slept by him the whole time that they were repairing the jaw and trying to, work with him and get this accomplished so that he could be comfortable again. And she didn't give up. She didn't say, well, I guess that's it. I shouldn't do anything more with him. So that was a very typical of Laura, who is just not only a go-getter, but loves her horse so much and would never leave him alone. She was fantastic about that.
Mm-hmm. And I think sort of along the lines of that mantra, it seemed that several of the riders had talked about, not in a direct way, but the mental aspect of the game and just almost never giving up when the pressure, whether it was in competition or trying to make some horses work. I think one that comes to mind was, Kent Farrington. He had just talked about how, in this sport, so many things are out of your control. And, what is under your control is managing the horses and having people around you to support them. What you have to do is plan on being ready for opportunity when it comes your way. And I thought Kent's story was very interesting because of that.
Well, Kent, an example of Kent and his really tough go-getter attitude is, he was injured when he fell off a horse he didn't know very well, and his leg was broken, and I had the same break, almost the same break, and it took me 10 months to recover. And he started rehabbing as soon as the operation was over. And of course, he's been winning ever since. He just doesn't take no for an answer. And it was really, it's a funny story about Kent, because for Christmas when he was a child, he and his sister got plastic horses. Well, neat. There's something nice to find under the Christmas tree, but not for Kent. He gave his to his sister and said, I can't ride a plastic horse in the Olympics. And it turned out that actually his real present was a pony, and his parents took him out to see it. But that was an example that even as a child, he knew what he wanted to do. And of course, he wound up doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think the same can be said for McLean Ward. I was struck by, he talked about a huge moment was at the Rio Olympics, and he was the anchor, and they had thought that they had a shot at the gold, but it turned out that France had a clear round and clinched it. But he still had to go in just for the U.S. to even medal. He still had to go in and get a clear round. And he talked about how he had 45 seconds to sort of digest that they lost the gold, but he still had to go in and do a job. And I know you know McLean so well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, McLean's focus is unparalleled. He knows what he has to do. He goes in and does it. And that was just the most perfect example of the Olympics, where thought they were going to be going for gold, and then they found that they couldn't be. And he didn't go into the ring and get distracted and think, does it matter as much anymore? Or he wasn't upset. He just said, I know what I have to do, and I'm going to do it. And that's the way he is about everything. And at the same time, he's a very nice person. He's always kind to the children that come up to him, and the adults too, asking for autographs. He always gives them some time, and he hands his ribbons out very often along the rail when the crowd gathers after he's won. So he just is somebody who's an all-around person. I admire him very much. He knows what he has to do, but at the same time, it's not so consuming that he can't be a human being and connect with others.
Mm-hmm. And another story that struck me was Boyd Martin. One little anecdote he talked about was, and he certainly had a very interesting route to the top, but he talked, and I guess this comes back to not giving up or taking advantage of opportunities was I think he was back in Australia after traveling a bit, and he got a horse to ride from a man who had just gotten out of a maximum security prison for attempted murder. And I guess, could you talk a little bit about Boyd and just kind of that never give up, or taking advantage of every opportunity you can?
Well, one thing I would say about Boyd, I mean, he's the gutsiest rider ever, and I think that comes from growing up in Australia, and certainly it was a very difficult way for him to get to where he is. He worked for a man who was rather demanding, shall we say, and after one event where the jumping didn't go so well, they got back to the farm at 3 a.m., and the trainer set up a course and made all the horses go over it. It was a course that mimicked the thing where they had problems at the event. So Boyd is very gutsy, and I think that's one of the reasons he's had so many injuries. He's famous for putting pictures of his x-rays online and giving us the details of his surgeries. But he realizes now that he's getting a bit older and he needs to preserve himself for the more important things. He realizes now that there's a bigger purpose, and that comes with maturity for a lot of the riders who are gung-ho when they start out and perhaps don't always have the best judgment.
I thought it was interesting how Laura Kraut got the ride on Simba Run, who kicked off her international career. It had been a 105-degree day at a horse show down in Tennessee, and it was too hot for Simba Run's owner to ride him, so he asked Laura to ride the horse instead, and the rest is history. Can you speak about that story?
Yeah, it was interesting. It's funny how these things come about. Jeff Sutton, who owned Simba Run, who was a thoroughbred and just a horse with a marvelous disposition and a great heart, just felt like, as an older person, it would be tough for him to make it around the Grand Prix in that kind of heat. And Laura, being younger people always are better in the heat, took over, and they just clicked. They were wonderful. And even though she has had many other terrific horses, including the little Ray Cedric that she rode at the 2008 Olympics when she was on the gold medal team, I think she's still most identified with Simba Run by those of us who knew her back in the old days, because that was a combination that clicked, that made her career, and it was charismatic that he was a thoroughbred, and he was as gutsy as she was.
And you bring up a good point about, a horses making someone's career, and several of the riders mentioned that. Stefan Peters comes to mind with Udon. Can you talk a little bit about how Udon came into his life and how they progressed?
Well, Stefan, for people that don't know, came from Germany. He was German, and it was a big thing for him to come to the United States. And Udon was a horse that was owned by his father. And when he came to the U.S., they sent the horse with him, which was pretty incredible. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of family strife because his grandfather owned a clothing store, and Stefan was expected to take over the job running that. And instead, here he goes off to America with his horse. But they never thought it was going to be an Olympic horse, and he brought it along to the point where he made the team. And I think everybody remembers that. I believe it was during the Grand Prix special when he finished his salute, he took a little American flag out of his pocket and waved it at the crowd, and it was one of those great moments. But I know that Stefan always thinks of Udon as the horse that was his foundation and enabled him to be a regular member of the team for so many years.
And then two other horses who come to mind were the section about Karen O'Connor, talking about Biko and Teddy, who were for sure very different in size and stature, but I know you know those horses well. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Well, Teddy was a pony, and that made him such a crowd pleaser. Who thinks a pony could go around the 4-star at Kentucky? I remember Jane Atkinson, who ran Rolex Kentucky for many years, kept an eye on him, and she said if he was ever struggling at any point, she was going to have the stewards stop Karen so that he wouldn't overreach from what his ability was. But it turns out that his ability was just enough to do anything that was wanted. But he was just a special horse, and he was one that captured the crowd. Anybody who watched him could see, just because of his size, that he was amazing, and they became instant fans, I think. And Biko was just the polar opposite, and real tribute to Karen that she could ride both horses so well. Biko was absolutely huge and dynamic, and took quite a bit of the doing, shall we say. But he was one of the best horses ever that we've seen in eventing on the U.S. side. And he was Horse of the Year. I think he was Horse of the Century for the 20th century, as a matter of fact, because he was just so consistent. And he was her horse at the 1996 Olympics. He was actually an interesting thing. As a young horse, he was really feral. I know the horses in Ireland, often are turned out for several years, and so they're not as accustomed to human contact as many of the horses that we raise here. So she couldn't. It took her 2 years before she could get on without someone holding him. And they're also different when you think about it. The contrast between Teddy, the pony, and Biko was obvious because of their size, but you have to think of the contrast among all the horses that these very experienced riders are involved with, because the personalities are different, the abilities are different, and they have to suss them out and figure out what makes them tick and how to get the best out of them.
And that brings me to, I was surprised in the section with Günther Seidel. He was describing Graf George, and I had not realized the horse was as excitable as he was. And Günther was talking about how he prepared the horse. And I think it was before the Atlanta Olympics, he said, he would have to get on sort of at the beginning of the day and ride him for an hour, and then, right during his warm up, another 45 minutes. Can you talk a little bit about Graf George? He had such an amazing presence.
I know that Günther felt bad about having to ride the horse so much in the warm up, but he didn't really pressure him. It was just to get him exercised, get him out, get him loosened up, and take a little bit of the gas out of the tank. So he didn't do any real movements. He just did a lot of transitions and things that just would loosen him up without getting him too crazy. I've seen people who do piaffe and passage before they go in the arena or in the warm-up, and it just, by the time they get in there, the horse has had it, does not want to do those movements, and you might see them rearing or refusing to do it, turning around. I've seen that so many times. And Günther was always good at knowing what his horses could and couldn't do and how to get the maximum from them with, really good horsemanship, great techniques that he developed over the years.
I found Lucy Davis's story interesting in that she talked about between the 2014 World Equestrian Games, where she was on the bronze medal team, and the 2016 Olympics, where she was on the team silver. She had a tough time, and she attributed it to forgetting how to actually ride and becoming over analytical. And every time something went wrong, she made it into an issue. I think that's something a lot of riders, whether you're at the local level or, obviously all the way up to the Olympics, people struggle with just overthinking, and sort of forgetting how to ride naturally. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, what happens when you want something too much? It becomes really beyond a focus. It becomes an issue and a mania sometimes. I'm not saying it was a mania for her, but people they focus on that and everything else around them drops away. And she finally realized that she needed to look at both sides of the coin. So you know what? She might make her dreams come true, or she might not. But she had to put things in perspective and just ride her ride. And she was quite lucky to have Robert Ridland as the coach, because he was somebody who understood her talent, understood her horse's talent, and knew that if he stuck with her, he would get someone that could really make a difference for the team. And she was able to do that. I know that he had talks with her, and she got herself together and kept her eye on the ball without thinking, oh, what if I don't make it? And so she wound up making it.
Mm-hmm. And Robert Rowland, there's a chapter about him, and I thought that was interesting. He gives a flavor of how the U.S. equestrian team operated under Bert DeNemethy, and how it operates now. Can you talk about the differences he noted between then and now?
Well, it was a completely different era. When the U.S. equestrian team was first founded, it was really, in some ways, almost along a cavalry line. And Bert DeNemethy was in the Hungarian cavalry, basically. He was supposed to be in the 1940 Olympics, but they were called off because of World War II. And so he was a very strict disciplinarian and someone who made sure that riders were properly dressed and that they had their manners when they went to the post competition parties. And Robert he's a Californian, and although he grew up under DeNemethy, or he in his late teens, he came to the team and rode under DeNemethy and was very had to toe the line, which he might not have had to do normally in his equestrian life. He kind of took the best of both worlds. The California, a little bit of laissez-faire attitude, but he also understood that discipline is important, and giving support to the riders is important, and giving them guidance whenever necessary. And he was very close to Bill Steinkraus, as I mentioned before, the captain of the U.S. team and the gold medalist. And Bill took him under his wing and really told him what was important and how to get the most out of team life. And I think that Robert remembered Bert and remembered Bill, and when he came on board, he did things differently than they would do, but utilized the wisdom that they had shown in getting such great results for the team, and bringing America into the forefront. America was an underdog after it lost the cavalry teams, and the idea of that they could compete against the big powerhouses, particularly Great Britain and even Mexico at that time, was a tough climb for the riders and the coaches, but they got it done.
Switching gears a little bit, another story that I had not realized that I found fascinating and sort of speaks to sticking to your plan or knowing your horse was Rich Fellers, and he had described when he was going into the jump off at the 2012 World Cup finals. He was jumping off with Steve Gradat of Switzerland for the championship, and in the warm-up, Rich said that he didn't want to jump flexible, which is an unusual approach, and instead he did walk-trot transitions and then went into the ring and won. I can imagine people thinking that's crazy because you tend to want to jump your horse right before you go in the ring. Can you talk a little bit about Rich's approach as you know it?
Well, he knew flexible so well, and that was what always paid off for him, that he and that horse were one. I mean, they really were. They were thinking along the same lines, and he knew exactly what the horse needed. And the coach had said, "Are you sure you don't want to jump before you go in the ring for this very important round?" And he said no. And instead, he just watched Steve Gradat, who has been number one in the world since then, and saw his track and figured out how to better it. And so he did.
One other chapter that I found very touching was the chapter about Amy Tryon, and this was obviously people spoke about Amy, and I liked what her husband had said, that for Amy it wasn't about beating so and so, it was about whether she could compete at the level of the Mike Plums, the Jimmy Woffords. Can you talk a little bit about Amy?
Amy was such an amazing person. You know, she was an EMT and firefighter. And that was, when you think of the strain that it takes to do a job like that, and particularly for a woman. I mean, I hate to say it, but, people forget that women haven't always been in those kind of positions. And Amy just was excellent at that, as she was everything and absolutely gave it her all. Um, she was so totally dedicated. She had to work harder than anybody else. She would do shift after shift after shift on her job with the fire department so that she could take enough time off to go to various events. And I'll never forget in the 2000, no, I'm sorry, it was the 2002 World Championships. She had a fall and she injured herself badly. But in those days, falls were not elimination on cross country. She got back on the horse and she finished. And then the next day, even though she's in tremendous pain, and of course you can't take painkillers when you're competing because they test you for drugs, she got back on and she finished, and we wound up with a gold medal.
Wow. Yeah,
that was Amy. She was inspirational, and she proved that even without advantages, as long as you try and you give it your all, it can be done. I mean, her horse was, she got him off an ad in the paper. He'd been like a mountain pack horse. And that's just, when you think about that, it's amazing. All these people spending 6 figures and 9 figures on horses from Europe. And here she had this little guy, and she was fantastic.
And that was his name?
Poggio.
Poggio.
Yep.
So Nancy, there's obviously so many wonderful stories in this book. Are there any other, last of the riders that our listeners might find interesting?
Yeah, I think the story of Debbie McDonald is inspiring because a lot of people don't realize that she was a 100 jumper rider and doing quite well in California when she had a very bad fall. And this was shortly after she'd had a baby, and she was reluctant to continue jumping because, it can be dangerous, and she felt responsibility to her child. So her husband suggested that she go into dressage, which, she had no experience at all with dressage. And she said, okay, I'm going to do it. And she went to Hilda Gurney, who was, at that time, a top trainer in California and had been on her 1984 Olympic team. And she learned dressage from the ground up. And obviously it was successful. She was a double gold medalist at the 1999 Pan American Games, and she came very close to an individual medal on our silver team at the 2002 World Equestrian Games, and of course she was on our bronze medal Olympic team at the 2004 Games. And her advice was always that if you work hard every day, show up on time, and give 100% to every single client and horse, you will find that a lot of people will come and support you, and that you'll be very successful.
And I thought what was also inspirational was that I believe she was 50 years old at her first Olympics.
Yeah, it was very cool. It was the 2004 Olympics in Athens, Greece, and there was a big birthday party for her. The team had a house sort of in the suburbs of Athens, and it was just a wonderful occasion where everybody was there. They were thinking about having fun and saluting her and just enjoying themselves, as opposed to all the pressure of the games and trying to win a medal. It was really a memorable night. I can call it up in my mind and see all the smiling faces, and Debbie's was the happiest of all because she had achieved her goal of being in the Olympics, and she had all her friends around her, and she was going to continue to go on to do other great things. At that time, she didn't know she would wind up being the dressage coach as she is now, but she knew that there was a lot ahead of her, and 50 was just a milestone. It wasn't anything else. It wasn't like, oh, you're getting too old. It really was a perfect stop along the way to salute somebody who changed her life and made a huge success out of it.
Right. And I thought what was also nice about Debbie was that she'd ridden Brentina or was involved with Brentina for 14 years, 9 years at Grand Prix, which I think speaks to Debbie's, passion for Brentina and the horses in general.
Debbie is wonderful with horses, and she cares about the horses, I'm going to say, as people, for what they are, for their personality. And Brentina's retired now in California, and she keeps in touch with the people who have her, and she still holds a very special place in Debbie's heart. I don't think I've ever been to as emotional event as Brentina's retirement at the 2010 World Cup finals in Las Vegas. where Debbie and her husband and the family that had supported her through the years and who owned Bentina were all gathered, and it was just the stands were packed. It was very, very, very exciting. And the Thomas family, they were thrilled to be in the ring and a part of it. You know, they couldn't ride the horse, of course, but Peggy and Parry and Jane Thomas were all there to support her, and that was typical of how things would go with Debbie, that people, once they got involved with her, they loved her and they would support her and be her friend, and be glad of it.
Well, as I said, Nancy, thank you so much for speaking with me, and just fascinating stories. And there's plenty more in the book, Riding for the Team. So again, thank you very much.
It was a real privilege to do this book and have the chance to talk again to many of the riders I hadn't seen in years, and get updates from those that I see more frequently. And I hope that the readers feel that they're getting a real personal introduction to these marvelous folks and what they've done with horses, and that it inspires them to do something even better with their own horses.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode with Nancy Jaffer about the U.S. Equestrian Team Foundation's book, Riding for the Team. And a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's episode, Perfect Products, the makers of Perfect Prep. Learn more at www.perfectproductseq.com. Join us again for upcoming conversations with eventer Ryan Wood and show jumper Katie Monahan-Prudon. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, please rate and review the show. I'm Sandra Olenek, and you've been listening to the Practical Horseman Podcast.